Welcome to Season 5 of the Long-Winded One podcast. Listen as we showcase original work from top Royal Road authors read by professional voice actors. Hear interviews from your favourite lit RPG and game lit authors. Lastly, listen as the Long-Winded One tries his hand at his first ever lit RPG novel, The Four Treasures.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of The Long-Winded One. This is a late interview for us, but I have the privilege of having another Royal Road author with me named Austen Keats. And he's the author of a story that I love and have reviewed. It's called The Book of Avalon Eternal. And it speaks to something that I have been into for years and years and years, and that is King Arthur. So welcome to the podcast, Austen.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we always do a get to know you question first, which is, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and anything that has sort of influenced you to date with your writing.
Yeah, so I live in New Hampshire with my wife. We really like the solitude and the natural beauty of this area. So I would say that when I was in college, I studied history and religion, and I feel like that was an extension of the things I was interested in when I was younger. Probably the thing or the first book series that got me into fantasy and sort of mythological themed literature was probably the Chronicles of Narnia. But then I shifted into the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. I actually avoided the Silmarillion until I was an adult because I was always pretty intimidated by it. I've read it once and feel like I got retained about 20% of it. So I think a reread or two is in order. But I would say those are sort of the foundational books of fantasy and mythology and things like, you know, things like that got me into this type of literature. And of course, if I was going to then start writing myself, then those were sort of the foundations that I was building on or pulling from in my own mind.
Well, what about Sir Thomas Malory or T.H. White?
I would say that Thomas Malory is my core sort of Arthur source. I feel like his work is interesting because you can tell that his intention was to collect a lot of the existing Arthur legends that he knew and had heard and had gathered and to put them into one kind of single volume. And I think that was pretty hard, a pretty hard task to do. I mean, something that he probably had to set his mind to for quite some time, especially in, this is, we're talking like early modern times here. And, you don't have he didn't have access to Wikipedia or the internet. So I feel like that it's really kind of remarkable that he could bring together such a wide series of uh, kind of like of disparate sources into one pretty comprehensive volume, at least in terms of some of the core stuff.
I want to know more about your time on Royal Road. So if you could you let me know how you discovered Royal Road and how has your experience been on there?
So I initially discovered Royal Road because I believe um my first point of interest or my first thought was I'd like to write something serially. Uh, that was sort of my first thought, probably earlier this year,
Mhm.
calendar year, that I'd like to write something in a serial way. And I think I had actually been thinking about like Charles Dickens, who would like sell his each chapter to the newspaper
Mhm.
and get like 50,000 readers they'd be like lining up around the corner to buy these newspapers. Just basically just started searching online for different platforms that allowed this type of thing. And whenever you start searching for that type of format, I feel like Royal Road comes up pretty quickly because it is so pretty big in this sort of realm. And I didn't. I just didn't know anything about kind of any of this type of online serial kind of ongoing literature writing. I think once I started to sort of post my writing on it, one of the things that I found really, and I guess the right word would be like reinforcing, was the feedback, because I think feedback for me at least is very reinforcing, kind of to see or to hear what other people think about what I've written, and also to kind of, just to sort of make connections with other people like this one, with other people who have similar interests, who also write. And because I think writing is like a really, well, by default, is a pretty solitary activity. And that can be, again, kind of by default, pretty isolating if you don't kind of intentionally make it otherwise. And so I think that I suppose the community aspect of Royal Road has been very helpful. As online communities go, it's actually like very supportive. Much of the time, if you post something that you've written on the internet, it's going to just get like obliterated. But in Royal Road, I feel like people are very, well, for the most part, very kind.
Yeah.
Everybody's sort of there for the same purpose, which is to, I suppose, read other people's writing and provide feedback. Then, you get feedback on your own writing. And I think it helps to develop or it's helped in some ways to sort of helped me to develop like my voice as a writer, I would say.
Well, have you engaged in I guess it's like the business aspect of the writing or the promotional aspect on Railroad? Have you engaged in, many of the review swaps or shout out swaps or?
So I definitely didn't know about shout out swaps until started to communicate with folks on the site. I did know I started to see this idea of review swaps as something to kind of get started, or a way to get started with getting reviews and making connections, because I think there's something like 51,000 stories on there. That's a lot of stuff. And there's some, really, really popular and cool things on there, with, tons and tons of followers. And so I think just in a way, review swaps have been very helpful, I suppose, from a practical standpoint, just to sort of get your writing noticed. But it's also helped me to make connections with people like this one, that have been really, really nice.
Well, what about Patreon? Now this seems like Patreon. If you click on somebody's profile on Royal Road, there's two different ways to support authors. There's the PayPal donation method, and then there's the Patreon. Are you partaking in either of those, or do you plan to?
At this point, I'm not, I don't have either of those on my site on Railroad, but I do intend to start a Patreon. And I like Patreon because of the ability to interact with people, maybe in a more direct way, or at least, that people who are on your Patreon really, really like your stuff. If you can build up that sort of base of people who support you and who like your writing, to me, that is even more reinforcing, just to know that, hey, I'm working and producing this, and it's affecting some other person in a positive way, So I think I would see, or I would, probably try to branch into Patreon at some point, and sooner rather than later. And then the more middle to longer term goal would be to hopefully publish or audiobooks, or if kind of the one follows the other kind of thing. That would be a really cool thing if that was to happen.
If there are other people who may be wanting to release something in a serial fashion as you have, do you have any advice for aspiring writers or new writers?
I would say probably, in thinking about how writing is a solitary activity and therefore can be isolating, is that in my opinion, one of the most important things is to get someone at least one person who supports you and is aware of what you're doing. In my case, that's my wife. She reads all of my chapters. It helps me to feel like that I'm writing, that I know that someone, at least somebody else, will see what I'm doing or writing. And I think it really helps to have someone who's supportive, but who's also honest with you and says, this part is weird. Edit this sentence, delete that altogether. The other pieces of advice are pretty much things that I've gleaned or gathered from other writers. Like, I don't know if you've ever read Stephen King's On Writing. Um, I think that's such a humane, like realistic and kind of sincere way of describing how to write.
I am familiar with it. My wife and I have talked about it several times about how he puts things in a drawer and he comes back to it like 6 weeks later. And if he still likes it, then there's something there.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And I think that, it's to me, I think it's okay to even go so far as to kind of mimic the writers that you like at first, when you're kind of getting that first draft out, or even when you're just starting to write for the first time, because we have to kind of, imitate in order to start to learn how to do something. And I think there's the two other things that really, or yeah, I think two other things that really, really have meant a lot to me is just this idea of, well, like, whatever you do, do not stop writing. Just don't stop.
Hmm.
The hardest part is, to me, is just getting that first thing out, because it's like I have to overcome that very negative and sometimes very harsh, like, critical voice in my head that basically says, like, I haven't even written anything, and it'll be like, "This you're these ideas are terrible. What are you even thinking? Don't even put that down." But you basically have to just ignore that, or at least if you can't ignore it, just do it anyway. Just write anyway. And the way I look at first drafts is that, to me, that's like getting, like, if I'm going to make I mean, I'm not a sculptor or anything, but like if I was going to make a sculpture, the first draft is like the equivalent of just like dragging a bunch of stone into the studio, and then after that, then I can like shape it into something cool in the most internal senses, just not listening to the critical voice in your head. And many of our favorite writers, artists, everybody else has also struggled with that. I think another word for it is just self-doubt. But it's hard to create something, and I think there is a lot to be said for even trying.
Austin, where can we find you online? Are there social media accounts or websites where we can direct people to find you?
So I currently have a Patreon, patreon.com/AustenKeats. I also have a YouTube channel, but it's just at Austen Keats on YouTube. And then, of course, my story at this time is being posted on Royal Road, also under my username.
Let's talk more about the Book of Avalon Eternal. We are going to hear a voice artist named John Kennard read the first chapter of this book, which really spoke to me. And I'm hoping that you can kind of frame it for the listener, because people are going to come right from this episode and immediately go to that episode. They'll be back to back. So tell us a little bit about what we're going to hear.
Um, so I think that my premise is, what happens immediately after the death of Arthur. This, with death in quotations, because there is this sense of he dies, but maybe he doesn't die. He just kind of disappears. And vaguely, he's taken into this place called Avalon that's outside of space and time. And that right there is an awesome idea, just in and of itself. That is like really sweet. And I think that this idea of, like with T.H. White's title, The Once and Future King, also has this kind of like a hopeful, but also like haunting, like appeal to it. Because he's gone, but then there's this ambiguity about, like, well, when is he going to come back? And if he hasn't come back already, like, how much worse is it going to get before he returns? I think that, but this whole middle phase about like immediately after he's gone, I mean, that's a huge vacuum in the lives of his, I suppose, community is a little too small of a word, but kingdom and court and everything else. That's the kind of the moment that I want to sort of focus on, which I think is really kind of a moment of crisis for the people connected to him. It was a moment of crisis that he could die, that considering that he may be about to die, and then it was a moment of crisis that he's just gone, kind of inexplicably. And so I chose the character of Gawain as sort of my main perspective character, because I think, there's some, there's so many different legends, but in some kind of strains, he's sort of earmarked as a possible successor to Arthur. And so, so he is sort of my main character, so to speak. But then the other character of Nimue is someone maybe a little more of a minor character. She often gets conflated with like other names, like the Lady of the Lake and Vivian and all these things, which but I really like to kind of pull her out specifically, and to kind of make her, in some ways, make her and Gawain kind of fusing into a single character, where the one, I mean, not really, but where the one kind of helps us learn about the other, and they become sort of a pair in various senses of that word over time. And I think that Nimue, especially as a sort of witch, is also like very compelling. And I think it also, in keeping with, I'm trying to sort of avoid, the immediate kind of latching onto like Arthur and Merlin. And in a similar way, the easy focus for like the magic folk would be like, Morgan, Merlin, and so forth. And so Nimue is someone a little bit like, Gawain and her are younger. Arthur, perhaps, I mean, there's different estimates, but he may have been 63 or 64 years old when he died, and had been king for quite some time. And so, and Morgan was older than he was. So and Merlin was, probably like Gandalf, like 17,000 years old or something, who knows? But, Gawain and Nimue are younger. And then kind of they face that situation that I think many youngish middle-aged adults begin to face, which is like, oh wow, now I'm the oldest generation, or I'm the adult. What do I do now?
Maybe I just didn't pay as much attention, but I didn't think of Nimue as a quote unquote witch. What was her role in the original literature?
So I think in the original literature, she's often been sort of named as the Lady of the Lake, who.
Gotcha.
But the Lady of the Lake was also sometimes named Vivian. In some legends, Vivian was, well, the Lady of the Lake, and the lake was in France, or at least in some sort of side parallel reality in France. And that in some legends, she actually raised Lancelot, which is why he's called Lancelot du Lac.
Of the lake, yeah.
Right, exactly. And then, so yeah, obviously in my story, Lancelot would be elder, kind of like an aging Jaime Lannister or something. And so I don't really do the Vivian Lady of the Lake. So I stick more with the Nimue Lady of the Lake. And I also just find really, really, really compelling her connection with Excalibur.
Well, it was in the description of how Nimue got her powers that I remember commenting to you that I kind of felt like listening to John Kennard read that part. I was like, man, I had flashbacks to Martin Shaw reading the Silmarillion. I think people are really gonna dig John's take on this.
Oh yeah, I mean, John really is an example of the power of a good voice actor. It's someone who obviously gives voice, but like it just animates entirely the words on the page, and I think in many ways kind of harkens back, or sort of taps into what's really the ancient kind of tradition of storytelling.
Well, Austen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me, and this was really enjoyable, and I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us down this Lit RPG deep dive. Please consider giving us a review on Apple Podcasts, and visit us over at longwinded.one, where you can see past episodes and find all of our socials, even our new Discord server. We hope you enjoy.